You're listening to The Creative Imposter, episode 132. Welcome to The Creative Imposter. I'm Andrea Klunder, podcast producer and strategist, and multi-talented, multi-passionate, multi-creator of things. And today we're talking with another multi-hyphenate creative individual about sex. Well, not actually sex, more like having a conversation about having conversations about sex and relationships and dating with sound therapist and somatic sex educator Karen Yates. Karen is also the producer and host of Wild Sublime, a sexy spin on infotainment, otherwise known as a podcast. Well, it's a podcast at the moment, but it was born out of a live talk show in Chicago that, due to COVID in 2020, needed to pivot, and now hopefully will be returning to the stage again very soon, fingers crossed for fall, and hopefully also sticking around my podcast app. Karen and I recorded this conversation way back in December of 2020, and we talk about an episode she released on Wild Sublime about dating during shelter in place. Side note, there is also a corresponding episode about being in relationship during shelter in place. The dating episode was about being upfront about COVID safety preferences, and personally, I think the conversation around boundaries and communication is still so relevant in this weird not yet post-COVID vaccine, not yet vaccine, are you fully vaxxed time. Stick around to the end of the episode to hear Karen's insights on that particular topic. One thing we didn't get to talk about this time around is the sound therapy work that Karen does. It's called biofield tuning. I've experienced it a couple of times and it's very cool. But since we didn't talk about it, you'll have to go learn more on your own. Links to Karen's website and Wild Sublime, of course, will be ready for you in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimposter.com/132. And now, allow me to introduce you to Karen Yates. And so I'm curious, when somebody asks you that terrible question like, oh, hi, Karen, nice to meet you. What do you do? How do you typically answer that these days?
Oh my gosh, Andrea, I tell you, it's so hard when you're a hyphenate. I have a sense that in the future, everyone's going to be a hyphenate. I really do think that. I think people are going to be exploring their various identities, and it's going to be totally cool. But now, it really depends on the milieu I'm in at that moment, depending on who is doing the asking. If it's someone that's just sort of rando, I'll usually say something like, oh, I do a podcast on sexuality, and I'm also an alternative healer in sound. That's like the most generic answer.
Do you have a sense of, if you say those two things, a podcast about sexuality and did you say alternative healer?
Yeah.
Alternative healer in sound. Those are both phrases that I would assume spark people's curiosity, or at least an inquisitive eyebrow.
For sure. Because then someone will veer into one or the other.
Right. And I was just going to ask you, does it usually go one way or the other, or it totally depends on the scenario?
You never know which way it's going to go. But basically, if people are a little shy about sex, and that accounts for a lot of our population, they will go directly to what kind of sound? Oh, and everyone will say singing bowls. And then I'll say, no, tuning forks. And then they'll be like, oh, and then they'll go down that. But then sometimes people will be like, oh, really? What's the name of your podcast? And then I'll say Wild Sublime. And then I'll open it up. I'll say, it is also a live show, and then it is now a podcast, and it will go back to being a live show in Chicago. And that's how that works. And then I'll expand that even more.
And so let's talk about Wild Sublime, because when I saw what you were doing this year with your show, I was so impressed. And of course, Karen would have made a brilliant, fast pivot when the world went to shit, right? And you were doing this live show, like a sex positive variety show. Would you describe it that way?
I would say it was probably really more like a talk show in the more traditional styles of like Jimmy Fallon or the old Carson show, where there was a one-on-one interview, a panel discussion, and then a couple of bits thrown in, like a couple of burlesque dancers or a storyteller. maybe a fun demo. But the bulk of it really was about conversation. So I usually say talk show with entertainment. That's kind of the best way, I think, to describe it.
Where did the idea for that show originate, and what kinds of places were you performing?
Well, I was in the process of finishing out my somatic sex education certification. And I had been in Tantra. I'd been a Tantra educator. And then I saw what somatic sex education is, which is basically dealing with sexuality and sex education from a body standpoint. So much sexual dysfunction in our society right now is addressed through the mind and talking with therapists. And it's only now that people are beginning to realize that the body is a storehouse of knowledge and that holds the trauma, and that to release the trauma, a lot of times you need to address the body first and address the nervous system. And so that was the area that I was in. And this was a completely separate path from the sound healing, which is known as biofield tuning. But while I was doing all of this, and I was kind of getting to the end of my certification, I had been in theater for many years. I had been a producer, director, performer, writer, playwright. So there was a deep history in my background of live performance. So I was sitting in my apartment one night.
I feel like there's so many stories that start this way.
Right, as you do. And I was just kind of feeling like, yeah, I should probably do a workshop or something soon. I kind of stoke the fires, get things going. And I was just kind of like, I don't really want to do a workshop. I just didn't. I kind of always feel myself on the inside. I kind of feel what's going on? Where do I want to go? And as I say, all of a sudden, the whole idea just dropped into my head. Literally, it just dropped into my head. And I saw the whole thing. And it was slightly different, but not really. I mean, it was all about like a panel discussion with a little one-on-one. And at first I was like, oh, that's going to be what it is. And pretty quickly I thought, I don't know if this is going to hold people's attention. I should add burlesque dancers.
We need tassels and glitter.
We need tassels and glitter. And that was the beginning point. That was really the beginning point. And so, when I was younger, I've had really great ideas all my life. I tend to be an idea generator. It's the taking action part that used to stymie me because of, I was a lot less confident when I was younger and low self-esteem. And so a lot of times I would have these great ideas, these great theatrical ideas, and then I would see someone else do them 2 years later because I hadn't taken action. And so I'm no longer in that place. And so I was like, once the idea dropped in, I'm like, you got to activate. And for me, activating a lot of it is just taking a small step. It doesn't have to be like building the Taj Mahal. It's just take a small step. So I literally started just talking to people like, here's my idea. What do you think? And they'd be like, wow, that's a great idea. I don't really know anyone that's doing something like that. And then it moved to, okay, everyone's vetting this idea for me. They're like thinking it's a good idea. What do I do with it? And then I'm like, okay, start thinking of venues. And there was a venue very close to me called Uptown Underground. And I got a meeting with the venue owner. We had a sit down meeting and she was great. She's like, I think this is a good idea. And we worked out terms that I would rent the facility once a month for a show. And she gave me a lot of information. And then, about 3 weeks before the first show, the organization went bankrupt.
Oh, no.
I'd already started doing I don't know. I think at that point everyone was booked. All the guests were booked for the show. And I flipped out for about 30 minutes. And then again, I just started my fingers tapping madly on the email. Like, does anyone know of any new venue place, any places I can rent? And then by the next day, because I knew this place was a home to so many independent producers, I'm like, they're all scattering through Chicago. They're all ringing doorbells. They're all making phone calls. I got to get out there. And by the end of the day, I had a new place rented. I think I didn't get the same date, but I got the next day.
Yeah.
And it all worked out. And that was Stage 773 on Belmont. And that was our home for 4 months until all the shows sold out. And so I realized I could do a larger venue.
And Stage 773, I mean, that's a bigger, more centrally located and probably more expensive venue than where you were originally going
to. It was one of those things where everything really worked out. And I can't remember exactly the financials of Stage 773. It didn't hurt. Let me put it to you that way. It wasn't owie. And I realized, I'm like, wow, this caters to a much more, this location does not cater to an alt crowd. Because the show is about no matter your sexual preferences, orientations, or relationship styles. So it's really about openness. And we talk about kink, we talk about vanilla sex, we talk about LGBTQIA issues, we talk about just how to relate to each other. So I realized within like a couple of days, like, wow, this is a really great thing. This moving into this more traditional mainstream venue, this is going to be very helpful.
And that was one thing that I was thinking, and I'm going to go back to your pivot in a minute, but when you said like it sold out fairly quickly, I mean, as someone who's produced a lot of independent theater and you've been around the Chicago scene with storefront, non-equity type theater productions, often we find ourselves as theater people in this thing where it's sort of like a silo, like you're producing these shows for your friends and family and friends of friends. And you're like, is anyone else outside of that bubble ever going to come see our show? Do we have an audience for tonight? I remember being in productions back in my theater days. And this was before smartphones and stuff in the early 2000s, when it'd be like you show up to the theater and you actually don't even know if you have an audience for the night. Maybe you sold 4 tickets or something.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have a sense of why it was successful. How did you fill those seats so easily?
Well, before I tell you that, I do have to tell you the week leading up, because the day before there were like 4 tickets sold. And I remember going to an event with a partner at the time, and I was like, there's 4 tickets sold. He's like, sorry, like, I can't help you, and I was like, huh. But then that night I was in the dressing room and, it was 8:00, time to go. And they kept holding and kept holding and kept holding. I'm like, why are they holding? Why are they holding? I was waiting for the stage manager to come back and give us the cue, the places. And I was like, what's going on? So finally I see her. It's like 10 after. I'm like, what is going on? She's like, people are still streaming in. It's totally sold out. It was like one of those like, yes, what? I don't know how this happened. Because basically people just decided they didn't want to buy tickets. They just wanted to show up, because people these days are so much more, I'm feeling my way into this. I don't know if I want to commit to a ticket. But why did it sell? Because by that point, I had become pretty embedded in the sex positive community. So I was no longer really in the theater world. And like, you are so correct. There's an echo chamber of actors and directors talking to other actors and directors. And in the sex positive world, yes, there are some performers, but not so many. And so I squarely marketed it at that community. So people that were like in the polyamorous circles, all the sex positive events I attended, and I just jumped on a chair or something, and I old fashioned producing, seriously old fashioned, like with the flyers in my hand, like, people, there's a new show in town. Let me tell you about it. I mean, really, it was nuts. And of course, well, I should say I'm very good at that kind of stuff. I like jumping on a chair and shouting. So it wasn't terrible. And really, those are the folks that showed up. And I have to say that people from the kink and the polyamorous and just the sex positive circles in general formed the core audience in the first number of months. And then what ended up happening is sex therapists, sex coaches, people whose business it is started coming. And what then happened as we moved it to Constellation, because that was the next venue. It's a music venue on Western Avenue run by the incomparable Mike Reed. That again opened it up to a new crowd, because they were a music venue. They weren't a theater venue, and they had their own lists that were music-based lists that they were sending out to. So yeah, it started becoming a networking event for people in the sex professions. every month people knew that they would go and they'd see people they knew. And so I started forming a post show called The Afterglow, where at first it was fairly, I don't know, it was just kind of, I don't even know how I did it in the first couple of months. Basically, I invited the guests to come out and mingle. Oh, I think I'd brought on a business director by that point, and he suggested bringing in vendors who could, independent vendors, not like big companies, local vendors who maybe couldn't afford the table cost at doing like an expo.
Yeah.
So it ended up being, it's been a really lovely thing.
By the way, side note, your pun game is very on point with things that you're creating with the Afterglow. And you have a section of your show that you call your sermon on the pubic mound. And your pun game is very strong.
Thank you.
And secondly, I think it's really interesting. I hear that you very clearly knew your market and your audience and the niche that you were going into. Also, you had this unique combination of knowledge and experience and background. So you could take your theater producing knowledge and experience and combine that with the community that you found yourself and make sort of a unique hybrid of those things. I also want to go back to this. We've used the word sex positive, and I think I only heard that phrase maybe like in the last 2 years of my life. So like 40 years on this planet, having never heard that phrase before. And you talk about kink and polyamory. And I have to say that these topics make me blush still to this day as a full grown adult. And I sometimes wonder, as a Midwestern, cis-gendered, hetero-monogamous individual who is very easily made to blush when these topics come up, where does someone like me fit into this world? And how do you approach it for someone like me who's a little like, ooh, I don't know about this stuff?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and your question is such a great one because it's a great one, especially since the original show is different from the podcast. The podcast is becoming, I think, a little more open to all voices. I think before the live show was a little more, we're going to talk about everything, but we're also going to, like in terms of relationship communication, that stuff's basic. It doesn't matter what sort of scene you're in. But when it came to other things, I always made sure there was someone representing kink on the stage. I always made sure there was someone representing alternative relationship styles like ethical non-monogamy. So your question is a great one. And for me, the idea of sex positivity, and there are a number of definitions, but it's really that we are free to express ourselves, however we would like, as long as it's consensual. What happens with folks, for the most part, is let's say you identify as cisgendered, monogamous, and with a vanilla sexual lifestyle. So what happens a lot in society is that people just take it for granted that that is what they are. And they don't think that there's anything beyond. And I'm not saying that like non-monogamy and kink are definitely what's beyond it for anyone. What I mean to say is people don't explore. They don't explore their bodies. They don't explore new things with partners. They don't know the connection they have to their body. They don't even know how their body responds. Maybe there's been trauma. So there's sort of a low pressure system, if you will, always at work when it comes to people and their intimacy. So sex positivity, like sometimes I think when you listen to the podcast, which is now a bit different from the show, it gives people just ideas like, that's interesting. And it's just like little drops. It's like little droplets into the mind of like, I could think about this differently. And maybe you just listen to the podcast and you go on your merry way and you don't really think very much, but something's just gotten dropped in that like, hey, it's okay to have a desire in this direction. It's okay to want to explore this thing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's really about, for me, the show and the podcast is about removing the shame. And I hear what you're saying about the blushing. I mean, my God, I don't know what turned it for me, but really, I was very uncomfortable. Not uncomfortable. That's not the right word. I mean, and you might agree, when you're in theater, there's always sort of a looseness and people are casual and there's a lot of like...
You see a lot of naked people backstage from a very
You
young age.
And like maybe you're doing like physical explorations with each other. So you're rolling on the floor with people. And like, so there's a general like ease around body stuff, which is helpful. And so I always say this because I had ease around touching people or being comfortable in various states of disrobing backstage. But when it came to actually, say, communicating around sex or going deeper, I didn't. And I don't even know if there was like a question that even a sense that I could. Like It didn't kind of even occur to me. And so when I got divorced like 5 years ago, that just kind of opened a whole new door for me. And, part of my story is that I got together with someone who basically was like, hey, you can own your pleasure. You can do what you want. And I support that 100%. And I don't know, maybe it was the fact it was a new relationship or the quality of the relationship we had. This put me in a new zone, a new zone of inquiry, if you will. And after we ended the relationship, I then thought, wow, something really significant happened with us. And he gave me a lot of information about his life prior that was more sexually open than I had experienced. And so I continued an exploration after he and I split that took me to Tantra yoga, and then eventually took me to somatic sex education. But this idea of freedom is very important to me. I suspect my dad was bisexual. Mm-hmm. I don't know this for a fact, but I strongly suspect it. And I saw him suffer. I saw him suffer because of this. And, maybe that's baked into me. I don't want people to have to suffer with their desires, because you can be who you want to be, and it can be marvelous. It can be wonderful. And that is part of the spirit of the show, of really allowing people the bandwidth to, when it was live, and it's going to be live again, to just sit in an audience and hear people talk about sex without being like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, or there's kind of I call it a camouflage. And I mean, I love burlesque shows. Don't get me wrong. They are their own thing. But like sometimes when you're watching sex things on YouTube and what have you, there's like a brassiness. There's a quality that I find it turns me off, because I'm like, I call it a mask or a camouflage. It's not. Yeah,
like a performative aspect of it.
Yeah. And it does, to me, in a certain way, speak to the general uncomfortability that we have as a culture. Yet I don't want to be antiseptic. This isn't a scientific show. This isn't about like, occasionally we'll talk about anatomy, and we had a segment that was ongoing on the show about like, hey, let's talk about anatomy, and let's talk about, what is a vulva, and look at all these like thousands of different types of vulvas, and just kind of like, let's just talk about it. And it's cool.
Yeah.
So
on the podcast, you call it sexy infotainment. What is the phrase that you use?
A sexy spin on infotainment. Yeah.
Yes, a sexy spin on infotainment. I'm like, this is like the perfect tagline. I need you to start writing my puns and my taglines for all of my content.
Well, it's funny. All of this has been registered with the U.S. government. Yeah. I'm like, these are good phrases,
And that's the producer side of you.
Totally the producer side of me. What can I say? Yeah.
This Not Your Typical Self-Care series has been all about the mid-episode stretch breaks. Do you love them? Do you actually do them? Can you take 30 seconds right now to give yourself a physical treat? And then after the episode, let me know what you think about these in a review in Apple Podcasts, the link for which you can find at ratethispodcast.com/creative. And now to move our bodies just a little bit. If you're standing, pause. Place both feet on the floor just a bit wider than your hips and slightly bend your knees. Now, start to draw a giant circle in space with your hips. Go as slow as you want to go. If you're sitting, scoot to the edge of your seat, put your feet on the floor, legs uncrossed, and from your pelvis, tilt forward, lifting your chest. Now lean to your right, tilt all the way back in your seat, rounding your upper back. Now to the left, and now forward. Again, smooth it out into a circle. And in both cases, go ahead and switch directions with your circles. Take a few more rounds. And once you feel complete, come on back to center and carry on with whatever it was you were doing. Today's invitation is for the podcasters and aspiring podcasters out there in the audience. My conversation with Karen Yates continues over on my other show, Podcast Envy, which you can find wherever you're listening to this episode and at thecreativeimposter.com/podcast envy. We're talking strategy and Karen's splendid pandemic podcasting pivot. And in fact, after our conversation in December, Karen decided to team up with my company, the Creative Imposter Studios, to edit and consult on strategy and best practices for Wild and Sublime. If you have a podcast question of your own, why not sign up for Podcast Envy Office Hours, a complimentary conversation about strategy for your show, wherever you are in the evolution, even if you're still just planning. We'll record our conversation and air it on an episode of Podcast Envy. The link to apply for your very own office hour session is in the show notes. And if you produce a podcast that has guests, I'd love to invite you to invite me to be your guest. Or if you have a favorite show that you think I'd be perfect for, I'd love an introduction to the host. Right now, I'm particularly interested in having conversations around how to apply podcasting in various niches for business, charitable missions, and education. How to become more confident in your voice and the content you create, and how podcasting saved me from bankruptcy, depression, and imposter syndrome. So if this sounds good to you, drop me a note at andrea@thecreativeimposter.com and let me know what you want to talk about and how is best to schedule with you. And now back to Karen Yates. Speaking of this idea of owning your pleasure, becoming more open to what's available and reducing shame, this is part of a series of talking about what I'm calling not your typical self-care. And I think that so often we would not necessarily automatically put sexual pleasure into self-care. And on the podcast, you've had a couple of episodes that were back in the summer. What were they called? Getting Laid During COVID, parts 1 and 2. Part 1 was dating and hooking up, and part 2 was long-term relationships. And I mean, I am in a long-term relationship. I live with my partner. Weirdly or not weirdly, we have separate apartments in the same building that we mostly cohabitate in the same space together, but we have the ability to disengage with a floor in between.
You are living the dream. Can I just say that? I'm like, you're my hero. You're my new hero.
When we first started doing that, I felt really weird about it. Like I didn't want people to know. And now I'm like, oh, this is actually ideal. But then I also have a lot of friends who are single and are living alone and are trying to navigate online dating and honestly, not even online dating, but just like being alone all the time, where the only way that they have any kind of face-to-face in the same space human connection is like, I had one friend who said she was like making up reasons to go to the grocery store. That was a very long-winded way to say when we're thinking about this topic and we're thinking about the context of this year, what have you seen in terms of taking care of ourselves at this time as relates to sexual intimacy, pleasure, et cetera?
Well, I mean, you bring up some excellent points. And I loved your first point, which is, a lot of times sexual pleasure is not lumped into the self-care bin along with bubble baths and scented candles.
It's like bubble baths and pedicures are always like the go-to.
What is that? I mean, it's
marketing.
I
That's
know.
marketing.
I know. It's like
Calgon, take me away.
Right. So COVID has been a blessing in that I think it helps people get really clear on what is important to them. So one of the points that was brought up on the show around being single is COVID is a lifestyle. And I think Tazima Paris said this, intimacy coach Tazima Paris. And what she meant by that is everyone has a different way they're working COVID around, like, are you fairly casual? Are you a mask wearer, but like, your pod is fairly big, or all the way to the other side of it, are you kind of not leaving your house a lot? Do you have an elderly parent or are you immunocompromised?
Yeah.
Right. And so I loved when she said lifestyle, because it's a great word because it encompasses all of your life. This is how you're living your life. So to really kind of drill down and say, what's my lifestyle? Where am I? And front load it. When you're dating, or if you're online, front load that. If you're online dating, it goes into your profile, like in the first couple lines, and some guys I see online are like, yeah, I'm going to be doing Zoom dates till they get a vaccine. Other guys are like, you don't see a lot. I mean, not a lot of people are front loading it, but I like to walk. I like to go for, walks. Okay. And then like, once you start, engaging with someone like verbally, you just put it out there. These are the specificities of my lifestyle. Where are you? And do it so early that it's not personal. It's not like you've like already had multitudes of Zooms and phone conversations, and now your heart's a little squished when they're like, oh, please, I am so not down with that. Whatever you're putting out there, because
it's not an, oh, by the way.
Right. Right. It's not an, oh, by the way. And I think people say with an STI are more used to this kind of way of communicating with partners. It's like, oh, by the way, I have herpes, or, oh, by the way, I'm HIV positive, but I use PrEP, or, whatever they've got, I have genital warts. If you're not used to communicating around sex, this might seem like a bit of a hurdle, but it's actually very good because it's a boundary. It's a boundary and you get to figure it out ahead of time. And maybe the other person is a little more casual, but maybe they're willing to negotiate with you. Be like, okay, cool. Let's go for some walks, and we'll wear masks, and we'll stay, 6 feet apart, and you can like talk about it. So in terms of dating, that's a great thing. And the long-term relationship one, I rebroadcasted it because I felt like in the beginning, people were like, yeah, I'm living with my partner. So what? This is a little owie, but we're going to get over it. But I'm like, okay, like 9 months later, are you still kind of chill with everything? Like, let's rebroadcast this one, because I noticed on the downloads, the dating one got huge hits, but the long-term relationships, not, but then interestingly, when we rebroadcast that one, a lot of downloads. And again, important stuff, we kind of roll through our lives with a partner. And, maybe if things aren't super awesome, we've carved out our own life within the relationship that might be fairly separate from the partner. And what I think COVID has done is basically made everyone look and be like, okay, what's the state of the relationship? Now, it's interesting because I've had friends who are extremely busy people. They barely see their partner, and now they're joined at the hip with not a problem. They're like, it's crazy. I never thought the transition was going to be this easy, and it has been. And, other people are a little more challenged. And it's really about, now carving out how can I have a life, being super intentional about your own needs. I mean, you have your own apartment. That's awesome. Not a lot of people do. But, like, how can I say to my partner, I need to be alone. I need to be alone for like 3 hours in our space. Can you go away? I need to chill out. And, depending on what kind of relationship you have, that can be a hard conversation. Maybe it pushes if you've had a real habitual relationship that looks the same over and over again. Maybe now it's time to say, we got to evolve. How can we find each other new and exciting and interesting? Because we're infinite beings. You know what I mean? We're infinite beings, and you've gotten into a rut. It's just that simple. Yeah. So, yeah.
It's interesting because the equation that I just wrote down was for both of those scenarios, the dating and the long-term relationship, it feels like the equation is the same, which is communication plus boundaries equals the freedom to explore and play within that.
Yeah. Basically, yeah.
Because once you've set those parameters, like back to your definition about consensual, right? Once you've had the conversation, you've come to a consensus on what feels safe, then we can explore the edges of that. Mm-hmm. Back in the beginning, you mentioned trauma and a lot of the ways in which we store trauma in the body. And I just had a conversation with another podcaster, Lisa Lackey, whose show is Inside Out Conversations. And she's been talking a lot about trauma and racism. And she's a clinician. She works with people with addiction and also works in the sex addiction population. And we were talking about how sometimes, the way that trauma shows up in the body, and sometimes you need to release it, and sometimes you need to be alone, and sometimes you need this and that. We were talking about how there are also people right now who have never really thought about trauma. Maybe it's not even a word that's really in their vocabulary that much. And how sometimes when you're having this traumatic experience, either this perpetual low grade, never ending traumatic experience, or something significant that happens, someone close to you passes away, you lose your job, that sometimes you really don't feel sexual at all. And you really don't want to be touched. And this came up for me last year. I had surgery. I had a breast cancer diagnosis and a mastectomy and reconstruction. And after that experience, I did not want anyone, not my partner, not anyone, to touch my body almost for like a year. It's almost 2 years out that I'm still getting back to a space where I can experience my body physically in a pleasurable way versus in a tentative, I'm bracing myself. Okay, I'm going to allow myself to try to get in the mindset where I can maybe do something intimate. Maybe if I focus and concentrate really hard, like being able to trust being in my body and experiencing things. And at first I was like, what is wrong with me? Why don't I want to have sex? Why don't I want to be touched? So I'm wondering, for people who are feeling completely not sexual and not wanting to be anywhere near that, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And your story is a common one. You're not alone in it. I recently had a friend who had breast cancer and is also doing the estrogen inhibitors.
Oh,
and
God.
That will just, it'll kind of blow out your system. I guess I'll start by saying we are genitally obsessed in our culture. and it's this idea that sex is about the genitals or the things that are identified as sexy, like the breasts. The erogenous zones are the sex zones, but mostly it's the genitals and the breasts, And what happens is the body is so much more than that. And this schism really, I think, causes a lot of, when I say a lot of people, most people, a lot of pain. Because at some point in your life, your genitals aren't going to work the way you want them to, period. You're either going to be stressed out, just general stress, or you're going to be sick, or you're going to be taking some sort of medication, or your parents will have died and you're in grief and you're not going to want to have sex. You're not going to want to have the intimate life that you used to have. And then let's add like any childhood trauma onto that where you've never felt, sexually juicy or alive. This has not been a thing. It's always been sort of tamped down. So in coming back to the body, it's about building, I think, a new relationship with the body. And it doesn't matter if you've had trauma or not. It's always good to build a new relationship with your body because the body gives so much information. And it's bottom line, no matter where you come from, it's going to be an expansive, extraordinary exploration. And it will give you so much information about yourself in a very joyous way. One of the things people can do, some people call it sensate focus therapy. Some people call it erotic mindfulness practice, but it's about can you lie down, or you don't even have to lie down. Can you dance around your apartment? Can you dance around your house? Can you be with yourself? You don't even have to take all your clothes off, and just allow yourself to touch your body, not genitals, not breasts. Just touch your body and start noticing what your body likes. What sort of pressure does it like to be? Do you like to knead your muscles? Do you like to lightly scratch? Do you like to deeply scratch? Do you like just light strokes? And with no deadline, to set time aside and just say, I'm going to do this for myself. Maybe bring some oil into it, something that you can massage into your skin. Maybe play the kind of music that you like. Maybe, as I said, dance or move, undulate, do whatever you want. Now, I say this, but, people will have resistance to this. This is something that, it might sound good on paper, but then, for my somatic sex education certification, we had to do it every day for a month. And I thought, and it evolves, eventually you take your clothes off, but it doesn't have to be sexual. It can just be about exploring the body. It can totally be sexual. You can move it into all these zones. But my God, when I first started, after 2 days, I'm like, okay, done. You've got to be kidding me. I'm going to spend.
Yeah, this is ridiculous. Why am I doing this?
Because I'm not talking about a 10-minute quickie. I'm talking about an hour. I'm talking about an hour of exploration. And it's come on, really? But things started it's hard to explain, doorways started opening up of oh, wow, I really feel sexy when I do that. Or oh, wow, that's interesting. I feel really confident when I do this. Yeah. So getting back to you can explore yourself non-sexually with touch. You can do temperature explorations. Do I like cold things on my skin? Do I like warm things? Do I like hot things? You could bring kitchen implements in, seriously, a little fork. Do I like that sensation? And you can explore around pressure, types of touch, types of temperature. And then once you get more comfortable, that you can then communicate it to your partner. So those are some of the ideas. And if you're solo, if you're flying solo these days, it's a great nurturing. It's a great nurturing exercise for sure.
It's interesting. I was just thinking how we immediately equate the idea of body sensation as sexual. And actually, like you said, it doesn't have to be. There's more of a range. It's the big coloring box, the big crayon box.
It's the 64 crayons.
It's the 64 crayons when you open it up to sensation and pleasure, which can include sexual sensation, but doesn't have to be.
Yeah. And pretty much all of the body can give pleasure. Think of your head being massaged. I mean, wow, that's super pleasurable. Or just touching your eyelids lightly. Someone or yourself touching your eyelids lightly, that can be very pleasurable. So really starting to open up around this idea of expanding, getting the 64 crayons rather than the 8 box or the 16 box. It's wow, I've got this body and I've been wandering around for a number of decades in this body. And wow, there's a lot more to explore than I thought. There's a lot more to explore.
Yeah. Brilliant. And for our listeners who are seriously considering the question of self-care, a little more than, as we mentioned, bubble baths and pedicures. What else is coming to your mind that you would like to share? Anything else that you would like to say?
Bring your body into it. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean just I am going to, I don't know, even buy a new sex toy. It's more to notice what your body is doing. Are you holding tension? Are you actually uncomfortable at this very moment because you're sitting in a weird position at your desk or your chair, and you're not really tuned in. You're tuned in on this other thing. You're tuned in on an interview that you're going through right now, but you're suddenly noticing your lumbar region is all hinky and you've been sitting for a while. It's that level of, bringing your body into your life. Your body is the thing that connects you to existence, period. When it doesn't work anymore, you're dead. I hate to be like, that's the Capricorn in me. No, it's the hardcore Capricorn in me. But no, really, your body is what connects you to life. And so to be gentle with it. I once heard a great advice: treat your body like a pet. Like, just be kind to it and be loving to it, and it will reward you.
So where are you? What is your body telling you right now? And how can you show it a little love? I want to thank Karen Yates for taking the time and for all of the creative work she contributes to the world. And as promised, here is her post-COVID-ish update on dating and boundaries. Now that the vax is rolling out and restrictions are lessening, quote, I would say in general, a lot of the date language looks the same and probably will stay the same for a while. If vaccination is important to you, you need to ask about it with potential partners. If you still want to wear your mask or be outside on dates, you need to clearly state your boundaries upfront. There will be a segment of the population for whom super strict boundaries will still be important, and then a larger and growing population that have become or will become more relaxed. You just need to know where you stand and go from there. The transition period will go on for a while, I think. End quote. Find Wild and Sublime in your podcast app and catch the rest of our conversation on Podcast Envy. Follow the links in our show notes to Karen's websites and hit me up if you'd like to talk podcasting with me on your show or mine. The Creative Imposter is mixed by Edwin Ruiz at Mondo Machine. Show notes by Lisa Witter. Theme music by Jovia Armstrong. Thank you for listening, and this week I'm giving you permission to feel yourself in whatever way that means to you. The transition period will go on for a while, I think. End quote. Find Wild and Sublime in your podcast app and catch the rest of our conversation on Podcast Envy. Follow the links in our show notes to Karen's websites and hit me up if you'd like to talk podcasting with me on your show or mine. The Creative Imposter is mixed by Edwin Ruiz at Mondo Machine. Show notes by Lisa Witter. Theme music by Jovia Armstrong. Thank you for listening, and this week I'm giving you permission to feel yourself in whatever way that means to you.